very much, and I really appreciate the chance to speak to you. Is it okay if I sit down? I think I might as well, yeah. I just arrived this morning and I left 8 days of over 36 degrees temperature, and that's 36 centigrade. So it's been lovely actually to be cooler. As you heard, I'm a demographer. I work on population. I've worked for 4 decades on migration in Asia and Australia, and over the last couple of years I did some work with the Ramfield Commission, who focused on the whole issue of migration and development, and that's certainly one of the themes that I'd like to take up tonight. I'm a demographer, so there's lots of tables and graphs, and I will skip over some of them because I want to get through in sufficient time to have some discussion. I think the numbers are relatively important when we start to talk about migration, because more than most discourses, the discussion of migration, not just in a policy context, but I think in an academic context as well, is far too influenced by unfounded material. And I don't think there's any area of public discussion which is so subject to self-interest and bigotry and a whole range of things. And I believe that the numbers are important. They're not the whole story, but I think they are really important to consider. And what I'm going to do tonight is to talk a little bit about the migration and development discourse, because I don't think the discussion on education is sufficiently, education and migration is sufficiently discussed in that development context. So I'll say a little bit about that. Then I'll concentrate on Australia and say something about Australia's demographic situation, because I think it does impinge on the whole area of migration. And then I'll focus in on the universities in Australia and international migration. And in doing that, I'm going to be looking at overseas student migration, which is something which everybody talks about. But I think there's an issue which isn't discussed enough, and that is the role of international migration in the staffing of Australian universities. And the reality is that there are very few areas of Australian professional expertise which are more influenced by international migration than is our universities, and I think that also can be looked at from this development perspective. And I'll finish up by saying something about an issue which is quite close to not just my academic work, but any sort of advocacy which I engage in, and that is that I believe that migration can be a positive factor in development of origin countries. It doesn't mean it always has to be. It's very much influenced by policy. And that discussion about migration and development policy is always about what can low-income countries do to maximise the influence and positive influence of migration. And I would argue that destination countries like Australia have got a definite role to play in that migration and development context, and that's what I want to talk about at the end. And I wish I had some answers. They're all questions, I'm afraid, but hopefully I'll get some answers from everyone here. One of the perspectives one has of when you've worked in something for a long time is that you do see change, and in many ways I find that an encouraging thing, that things which you thought as a young person would never change actually do. And working in Asia, working in villages in Asia, particularly in Indonesia where I work a great deal, there's been a massive change in personal mobility in that time. I go back to a number of villages which I originally studied for my PhD in Java, and the massive changes which have taken place there in just about everything. But I think in terms of individuals' personal mobility, that change has been even greater. People now move over much wider areas. They move internationally as well as nationally. So there has been, I think, a global transformation in mobility. And one of the examples I use in talking about international migration in Asia is that the very first conference I ever went to was in Japan, and it was a a 10-yearly conference which the United Nations has in Asia to talk about key population issues. And the first one I went to was in 1972 in Japan, and there wasn't a single mention in any of the things that I went to, but also any of the literature about international migration. Not one thing in talking about the population issues which were influencing the region. Now, the most recent one, last year, international migration was mentioned more than any other population issue. And that really demonstrates this massive change which has occurred in the significance of mobility between countries, but also, of course, within countries. And it's been this massive increase in complexity as well as the nature of the migration as well. This is one of my favourite graphs. It represents the number of Chinese travelling overseas, and in the social sciences you don't see graphs like this. That sort of upward trend is incredible to see, just this massive increase. And of course they're not all migrants, most of them are visitors, business travel and whatever, but it just shows this massive increase in personal mobility which is reshaping Asia. And I just want to concentrate on the relationship between migration and economic development in that discourse which has been going on for the last 7 or 8 years, initiated by the United Nations, but a number of agencies now heavily involved, including the World Bank, but I think the Ramphal Commission has also made a significant contribution in that area. And when we're looking at the relationship between migration and economic development, we can look at it from the point of view of the migrants themselves, the extent to which it improves their lives. We can look at it in terms of the destination and in terms of the origin. Now, with respect to individuals, in most cases, people benefit from migration. Where they don't benefit, it's because usually of barriers, obstacles which get in the way, and increasingly these are institutional barriers. They're rent-taking agencies of one kind or another which interfere to mean that the benefits of migration aren't recorded. And it's one of the things which I work on most in my migration in Asia is how do you make that migration work like it should work in terms of improving the lives of the people engaged, but also where they come from. I don't think there's any doubt that destination economic benefits are massive, particularly in a global situation where nations' wealth really is their wealth of human capital rather than the gold or whatever they have these days. It's the human capital which is crucial, and migration can be a major element in gaining from in building up that stock of human capital. And coming from Australia, where nearly half the population are either a migrant or the child of a migrant, one sort of sees in a myriad of ways how the nation has benefited from it. In Asia, though, many of the destination countries really don't see it that way. And there is this real mismatch, really, in terms of the evidence, in terms of what migration does, and the public discourse, which sees migration as a problem, something that has to be, if you have it, it has to be temporary, and they see it as some sort of temporary thing that they have to put up with, and it's slowly changing, but very, very slowly, in terms of countries really starting to accept in Asia that migration is here to stay, that migration is a structural part of their economy, not something that's a temporary nuisance that they have to put up with. And making that transition away from migration as something that has to be policed towards migration that is something that needs to be managed is really an important issue in the Asian region. But what about the origin countries? And this is where there's been a significant change in the discourse. Not among researchers, because researchers have always indicated that migration can be both a positive and a negative in origin communities. But in the international discourse, the focus has all been on brain drain, on the loss of highly skilled people and the negative impacts it can have on development. And just the big thing in the most recent debate, and the ILO and the United Nations and so on have been involved in that, is to suggest that it can have positive impacts in the right circumstances through remittances, through diaspora and so on. And Kofi Annan, in his work, his time as Secretary General of the United Nations, developed this idea of the triple win situation for migration. Not just the migrants themselves, not just the destination, but the origin. And how do we come up with policies to facilitate that triple win situation? So a lot of the discussion has been about how do we facilitate those positive impacts. Now, regardless of that, brain drain is significant and important, and particularly when we're looking at the education issue. Migration has become more selective, education-wise and skill-wise, in the movement between South countries and North countries. And the loss of human capital is a significant factor. And it's particularly significant in a couple of areas. And I think the health area is one which is very significant. And if we look at Australia, just taking some data from the last census, I think it's amazing that 1/3 of doctors in Australia now were born in Asia or Africa. 1/3. Now that relates to, if we take the whole of the population, it's about 6 or 7% of the population are born in Asia or Africa. So the selectivity of that, and increasingly too in the paramedical area, that there is that selectivity which occurs. And to me this has to be an issue, that countries which have got advanced health systems, high life expectancy and so on, are taking people with the sorts of skills, with these sorts of skills from countries which have got low life expectancy and low standards of health. And to me, although that's not my topic today, but it's something which does need to be addressed in a much more sophisticated way than it has in the past. The story about remittances, most people know. The World Bank has done a tremendous service globally in terms of now being able to measure remittances better than they have before. It's certainly not perfect in any way, but it has shown that remittances are about 4 times the level of overseas development assistance between South and North countries. They probably now are equal to the amount of foreign direct investment from North countries in South countries. So it is a massive factor in development, and making that work better is an important global issue. So where does education fit in? Education, of course, is fundamental to development. I always go back to that wonderful quotation when one of the best demographers we've ever had was asked if there was one thing you could do to improve development in low-income countries, what would it be? And he said to lift the education levels of women in those areas. And education is fundamental to development. It's also fundamental to migration. It's a reason for migration. Student migration is very important these days. But education means more knowledge about a community, it means more networks, it means more ability to be able to compete in the labour markets of those destinations. So it's crucial, and the development of a global education market has been one of the major components of what I would call the new international migration over the last couple of decades. And migration has become really focused on skill, and I'll demonstrate this with Australia in a moment, but there's just this incredible paradox in the world where skilled migrants are welcomed. Countries are now becoming more and more competitive in the ways in which they can attract skilled migrants. The other side of the coin is they're becoming harder and harder on unskilled migrants. So you've got this incredible juxtaposition of policies to attract migrants on the one hand, which have got certain sorts of skills, and policies which are really trying to stop people migrating if they don't have those particular skills. Just a sideline, in one of the courses that I take at the University of Adelaide, I once got the students to take the Australian skilled migration criteria, because Australia has a points test which people get points for a certain amount of education, work experience and so on. And I asked them to take all the data from the Parliament, from Australia, to take all the House of Representatives members, and we saw how they would score on the Australian points system. And under that, not one single parliamentarian would qualify as a skilled migrant to come into Australia. Now, it was cheating a bit because all of them were pretty old, and age is a very significant factor in that calculation. But it does indicate that increasingly migration is focused on that group. Of course, there's the refugee humanitarian program, whatever, but increasingly that focus on skill is enormous. And I question the way in which that serves Australia as in a number of ways, and I'm happy to expand on that in a moment. So the drivers of the new international migration, the Global Commission on Migration pointed to growing international differentials in what they called the 3Ds, in economic factors, in development, so traditional neoclassical views of what drives migration, but also demography, with ageing becoming a more significant factor, and in democracy, that people move from places which are less free to those that are more free. But there's also been the new forms of communication. Social networks are crucial, and the migration industry, those institutions which are set up to actually facilitate migration, are very, very important. I just want to say something about the demographic driver before I move on to Australia. This is a graph which was published by the World Bank a few years ago, but I think it says a lot. The left-hand side represents developed countries. And what that shows is that the number of people aged 15 to 64, or people in the workforce age groups, maxed out in 2010. From 2010 onwards, the number of people aged 15 to 64 in high-income countries is declining. There'll be 20 million less in 2020 than there was in 2010. Now, the other graph is low-income countries. Now, that age group in low-income countries in the next 15 years is going to grow by 1 billion. So migration's going to happen. To actually say that it's not going to happen or try to stop it happening is absolutely against the actual gradients which are existing demographically. Now, it's not demographic determinism, but that is going to be a significant factor. And in that context, I'd just like to look at Australia. Now, this shows the population growth rates of different parts of the world. The world's population is currently growing at 1% per annum. Australia's is growing at 1.6% per annum. Our population is growing extremely rapidly. You can see much more so than Europe and the new independent states as a whole. It's not growing at all. So Australia has got a rapidly growing population by any standards. And I just want to unpack that growth a bit. Part of it's due to improved life expectancy. It seems strange to talk about mortality when you're looking at growth, but in Australia, in my lifetime, we've added about 14 years of life to the average Australian, which is a massive change. And another thing which I think is important is if you look at the expectation of life at age 50 in Australia. And this is one of those graphs which I show to my first-year students who are all aged about 18, and I get a big yawn. Who cares how long people are going to live at age 50? But I must admit that I look at this in a fair bit more interest these days. But if you look at that, between 1900 and 1970, we added 2 years of extra life to an Australian age 50. Over that 70 years, you only lived 2 years longer in 1970 if you got to age 50 as you did in 1900. But look what's happened since then. We've added 9 years of extra life to an Australian age 50 between 1970 and now. Another way of looking at it is when my dad turned 50 and when I turned 50, I could look forward to 9 extra years of life than my dad could at that age. Now that is an enormous factor, not just in the growth of the population, because death is much less, but it's a factor in ageing. People living that 9 years extra than they were living 30 years ago. And that's contributing to a shift in balance towards the older age groups. The other thing which is contributing to it is fertility. And this graph is Australia's fertility rate, the total fertility rate, the number of babies women are having over the last 100 years or so. And that bulge is the baby boom. That's the births between about 46 and 66. The baby boom in Australia was bigger, and most countries had a post-World War II baby boom, but in Australia it was bigger and it was longer. It lasted for 20 years. And that has left an indelible imprint on the Australian population in terms of a bulge in the age pyramid, and you can see that there. In fact, you can see the year that I was born, 1946. Stick out here. This is when the soldiers came back from the war and were catching up on what they'd missed out on for the last couple of years. But it then continued on in this massive growth through a very high fertility rate of just under 4. My mother's generation had. And of course, after the 60s, it started to decline. So it's created a big group, and they've influenced Australia. First of all, when they went into school, then when they went into the workforce, and they're going to have a big influence as they move into the older age groups. You can see now they're 36% of the population. 25% of the population, 36% of the workforce. And they're going to be out of the workforce in the next 20 years, and that's going to create an enormous demand for people, which is just not going to be met by the young people coming up, and migration is going to be crucial. One of my colleagues, a public health person, sees it as this invasion of the baby boomers, people having hip replacements and so on. But it's going to create some real challenges for Australia in producing a new generation of workers to compete in the global economy, but also to replace that 1/3 of workers who are baby boomers who are going to be moving out. And universities are going to play a really crucial role in that. It's a particular challenge for Australian universities. We are going to see some growth in the 18 to 24 age group in Australia, but very little growth, even under very optimistic assumptions about fertility. But because of the increasing demand on the workforce for skilled people, the pressures on university are going to be greater, and especially in the context that the government wants to lift the proportion of young adults with higher education, university education, from 32 to 40% within the next 10 to 15 years. But also, it's an important part of the economy, and that $17.2 billion contribution that it makes to the Australian economy. Now, just if we look at the projections of the Australian population, the Bureau of Statistics projections, now deliberately presented their most recent 2 sets of projections because they tell you a lot about projections. You might recall, if you follow Australia, during the last election period, there was a focus on these projections which were done in 2008, which indicated that the Australian population would be 34 billion by 2051. Now, 3 years previously, when the Bureau did the projections, used the same methodology, they came up with 28 million. And what this shows is that the projections are very much based on what the demographic situation was at the time. 2005, pretty slow growth. 2008, massive growth, 2% per annum growth. And so the projections just really, say, right, this is what it's going to be if what it is today is continued on. And one thing we know is it's not going to continue on exactly the way it is. But they're the sorts of scenarios we're looking at. But the thing of the growth, even under the growth up to 34 million, look where the growth is going to be. 2/3 of the growth, which is going to occur, even under those really optimistic growth situations, is going to be in the 65 plus age group. And that's because you've got these massive numbers of baby boomers coming behind small numbers of people born during the 30s and 40s. And so we're going to get growth, but it's going to be growth of old people. And I say this all the time in the public speaking in Australia, and I cannot get it through. If you look at the new plans which have been done for Sydney and Melbourne and Adelaide and so on, they're all about young families. They see the population is going to grow, and it's going to be young families. We're going to see a very small growth in the amount of young families. this is where the growth is going to be. And that's a very different sort of growth that we've got to be planning for. But I'm getting a bit off the topic there. So we're going to see differences in the projected growth rates. Without migration, Australia's workforce would start to decline in maybe 5 or 6 years, because the numbers leaving through the workforce are going to be greater than those coming up through those age groups. And there's going to be significant impacts of ageing on the workforce. So migration is important. And I want to just say a little bit about migration before getting on to the universities. Australia is a country of migration, and you can see here 26% born overseas. The last census, 20% are actually Australian born who've got a parent born overseas. So 46% of the population are either a first or a second generation migrant. But more than that, there's at any one time there's nearly 1 million people in Australia out of the 22 million or 23 million that are there. 1 million people who are there temporarily, as students, as 457s, as visitors, as whatever. So half the population at any one time is a migrant, or the child of a migrant. Now, I often hear that the United States is a migration country. That equivalent figure in the United States is 18%. 50% in Australia, 18% in the United States. So we're dealing with a very, very migrant country. And it's a diverse country. And I study this stuff all the time, but every time we have a census, it bowls me over to see how much more diverse we are. 1 in 5 families now in Australia speaks a language other than English at home. Now that is remarkable, because it wouldn't have been 1 in 100 in 1947 that did that. It's a massive change. And it's a diversity which is different to most countries, because there is no one single group. It's a very, very diverse, multicultural group. And Australia's, has to come to grips with that, and in a number of ways. But if we look at the post-war period with respect to migration, it's been totally different to the rest. This is Australia's growth over the last 120 years or so. Natural increase is births minus deaths. Net migration is in-migration minus out-migration. And you can see how different post-World War II was to the period before that. And particularly you can see how recent years, how migration has been very, very significant in the growth of the country. 3 phases of post-war migration. Up to the 1970s, it was very much a demographic and economic imperative: grow the population following World War II, grow the workforce, shortage of workers, mainly unskilled workers. But the big change came because it wasn't just from Britain; it was from Europe. In the 70s and 80s, post-war baby boom, people started to come into the workforce. There weren't the workforce imperatives that there were previously, so the migration became highly planned. Skilled migration, refugees, family migration. And it became, the White Australia policy was buried, and so increasingly migration was from Asia. And then from the mid-90s, we've seen another period in which temporary migration is introduced for the first time in a significant way. And we became much more diverse, but the migration too, I believe, has become much more focused on skill. Family and refugee migration have become less. And I think one of the really key things is the skill dimension in Australian migration. These statistics, I think, really say it all about how migration has really contributed to human capital in Australia. You look at the proportion of the population with higher degrees in Australia. You can see among the Australian born, it's increased gradually. You can see in 1996 it broke into over 1%. It's about 1.9% for the Australian born. Much higher for the overseas born, 3 or 4 times higher. But the overseas born now make up 55% of Australians with a higher degree. Now, the overseas born are 25% of the population, so they're more than twice represented among those with a higher degree. And this represents the very high dependence in Australia, higher than just about any other country one can think of. The high dependence we have on migration for the highly skilled. Many would argue we don't put in as much emphasis as we should on the training dimensions of that Australia tends to pick up their high skilled people from migration rather than necessarily put the investment into developing them locally. Now let's just focus on migration and education. I want to talk first of all about students and then about staff. Now the number of students is a function of age structure because mostly the students are young, the participation rates, but also increasingly on the involvement of overseas students. And overseas students now are 1/4 of the students in Australian universities. Varies from one to the other, but overall about a quarter. If we look at age structure, this is and I'm taking the age group 18 to 24, which is the biggest group in Australian universities. You can see how it's levelled off, and it's going to continue to be around the numbers in that age group. Is going to be pretty stable over the next few years, and we're fairly clear about what the numbers are going to be because those kids have already been born, and we just have to follow them through. So it starts getting more problematical when you have to take into account the births because but when you've got the people that are already born that you're anticipating, you can be fairly clear about what the projections are going to be. I'll go back to I just want to focus on the student migration. There's been quite a significant change in attitudes towards student migration in Australia. I'm old enough to remember the Colombo Plan when I was a student in universities in the 60s. There was the fantastic people that you got to know who were under the Colombo Plan from Asia, the first group of Asian students coming into Australia. But then in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of migration associated with development assistance. I had a big program with Indonesian students coming, and the whole focus was on development assistance. And I can remember I was at Flinders University at the time, going to the Vice-Chancellor and saying, the United Nations wants to fund 20 students a year for the next 5 years to come and study with me here at Flinders. What is the fee I should charge them? And he said, well, we don't have any fees. And so we didn't charge a fee, even though the United Nations wanted to pay it. Now that changed very rapidly in Australia, and universities woke up very, very quickly. And I think the pendulum swung too much towards migration as overseas students as funding a significant way the university. But since 2000, there's been another role, and that is this nexus between student migration and skilled migration. There's a term been coined by a friend of mine in Canada, designer migration. And by that he means countries which actually get students to pay to come and do their education in Australia, which gives them the skills that they need to participate in the labour market, but also a knowledge of the labour market makes them much better migrants, and then they apply for migration. So migration is in two stages, temporary then permanent. Now, if you look at the United States, virtually all migration is all skilled migration in the United States is of that nature. But in Australia, it's becoming increasingly a pattern of a nexus between that student and permanent migration. So overseas students in numbers have increased massively. They're mainly from Asia, and Australia is the largest in the world in terms of the proportion of the overseas students, the proportion of university students that are from universities, and education is the third largest export earner in Australia. The outlook for foreign students is, I think, a mixed one in terms of Australia. Things are changing very rapidly in Asia. The United States has become much more active in recruiting. The Australian dollar has meant that it's more expensive in Australia. But also, we're seeing massive increase in universities in countries like China. Last year I got invited to China to talk to the government about them developing a skilled migration program in China. China is going to have a skilled migration program to bring in skills from overseas. And already, if you go to one of the top Chinese universities, you see a very significant number of European faces in the teaching staff. So it's changing quite rapidly. Plus, demography slipping in, that fertility is extremely low in many countries of East Asia particularly, so that the numbers of students coming through, they're still going to be massive, but they're getting less. So overseas students have been a crucial part of Australian university development in recent times, and many of them now moving across to permanent visas as well. This is where the overseas students transferring to a permanent visa come from, and you can see the dominance of Asia in that. What about staffing in Australian universities? And here migration has played a very important role as well. This is the number of staff at universities which have shown out from the censuses, and you can see that it's been a very rapid growth as the baby boomers got to university age. We had this massive influx of students into the universities, not just because of the baby boomers starting to get into that age group, but also because for the first time we had a government which suggested that university education should be opened up to most of the population rather than to an elite. So we saw this massive increase in staff, but then quite a period of lack of growth. Now that didn't mean there weren't more people coming in, but there was a lot of redundancies, people going out, but in more recent years quite a rapid increase in the numbers of university staff as well. So the numbers have gone up very rapidly, but it's been episodic in terms of the increase in periods of quiescence in the growth. So if we look at the age structure of university staff, this is 1976 during the real growth period. You can see very large numbers of young people. But this is the age structure today, and the dark age structure is the age structure of the total workforce. This age structure here is the structure of the university staff workforce. It is a very old workforce. You can see significant growth of women at last in the Australian university workforce, but most of the difference is in the older age groups. In fact, if we look at Australian university lecturers and tutors, the percentage aged over 45 is 53%. For the total workforce, it's 39%. Probably the only major group in Australia that are older than university lecturers is farmers. That's probably the only group that's older, and you can see some comparisons there. Doctors are younger, professionals generally are younger than the Australian workforce. And the reason for that is the massive growth in the 70s. When you had the baby boomers come in, you had a large numbers of young university staff come in, and they stayed there. And so they created a workforce which is dominated by a single age group. I'll just skip over those. So we have a number of issues in Australia in the academic workforce, and the ageing of the baby boomers is one of them. Because we've got these very large numbers, as I said, 50%, more than 50% of them are baby boomers. They're all going to go in the next 20 years. That's going to create a major issue in terms of demand for people in the academic workforce, much more so than in the workforce generally. But added to that, there's low levels of job satisfaction in Australian universities among younger people. We're seeing significant emigration overseas. Good Australian academics are competing very effectively on the international labour market. We've seen increased casualisation, which has made the academic career much less attractive to Australian young people. So that there are some real challenges which face the Australian academic workforce. I'll just get over a couple of those because I just want to look at migration in relation to this. Now, in the 70s, when the baby boomers, 60s and 70s, when the baby boomers started to come into the universities, where did Australia get its academic workforce from? Hardly any came from within Australia. I was a student in the 1960s in an Australian university. It was rare to have a lecturer who was Australian. They were overwhelmingly English but virtually all foreign. And Australia really relied on migration at that time. And, the question is, to what extent is migration going to play a role in this, what I would see as a second post-war massive demand for academic staff? This one's driven by baby boomers, but it's the retirement of the baby boomers which is actually driving it, rather than the previous one, which was driven by baby boomers coming into that age group. Now, migration has always played a role in the academic workforce. Migrants, academics, intellectuals have always been more mobile than other groups. And that mobility is very important. And if we look at and I apologise, this is probably a busy table, but if we look at the academic staff, you can see here 57% Australian born. So it's lower than the total population, which is 75% Australian born. But the academic staff, less than 60%. 42.3% of the Australian academic staff were born in another country. And of that, those from mainly non-English speaking countries, 25%. So a quarter of the workforce now in universities comes from non-English speaking background, culturally and linguistically diverse countries. And it's the most rapidly growing segment of the academic workforce as well. And I guess what I would argue is in moving into the future, it's going to become even more so in terms of that group. But migration is a two-way process, and one of my main research areas is looking at Australians who migrate out of Australia, which is very significant. And Australia has a very significant academic diaspora. But if you look at the entire period from 93 to 2012, you can see there were 38,000 incoming academics, but 21,000 outgoing as well. So we're looking at a very significant coming in and out. Now, the government attitude and the attitude of some of my colleagues working at migration is to say, this is fantastic for Australia. We've got 38,000 coming in, only 21,000 going out. Now, I think that's fine, but who are these? Who are the people that are coming? Who are the people that are going? What are they in terms of their characteristics, their quality and so on? In the work we've done on the outgoing migration, mathematicians are really significant in that group. Yeah, maths is so significant, the sciences. I mean, are those coming in better than those going out, or vice versa? Or is it, in what ways is it selective? We know nothing about what those dynamics actually are. International migration is increasing. This is where Australia has got its academics from over the last 20 years or so. Certainly the traditional market of England as an origin, but look at Asia now. Asia is far and away the dominant origin, particularly China, India, but also other Asian countries. Of course, we do very well out of New Zealand as well, South Africa and the United States and Canada. But where do Australians go? United States, Canada, New Zealand, the biggest destinations. But Asia now is increasing, and this when I first started doing these maps in the late 90s, Asia didn't come out at all. A bit for Singapore, a bit for Hong Kong, but look at it now. Asia is a very significant destination of Australian academics, and so we're seeing quite a changing situation. I think Australian universities are facing as I said before, their big recruitment challenge. Not the next couple of years, but over the next 10 to 15 years, it's going to be massive. And I talk about the 3 R's, the recruitment dimension of it, but also retention. I think part of it is retaining good older people, but also return, bringing Australians back from overseas as part of that system. Now, I want just to finish by bringing this back to development. Migration is going to become more significant in the future in Australian universities. There is absolutely no questions about that. And it's not just going to be the student migration part of it. And I think there are a lot of questions over the student migration. But it's going to be the staff staffing of Australian universities is going to be a significant challenge, and migration is going to be very important in that. And the question that I'd ask is, how do we make this migration work, not just to the benefit of Australia, not just to the benefit of the people involved, but is there some way in which this can actually have a third win, and that is in the origin countries? And one of the things I've been working on for a while is, the whole idea of how do you develop a development-friendly migration policy from a destination perspective. Now, it is a total cultural change, because migration policies, by definition, are self-interested. They are in the interests of the country of the destination. In fact, one would say overly so, and they do tend to represent the self-interest, and often when you look at the documents around them, they're nakedly, aggressively self-interested in the way in which they operate. In the discourse on migration and development, the whole focus has been on what can origin countries do to bring back people, to actually facilitate their diaspora maintaining an interest in sending remittances to, coming back to, facilitating spreads of ideas back into the origin country. There hasn't been any focus on the destinations, and can destinations play a role in all of these things, not just in facilitating remittances, but bringing people, enabling people to go back. And the thing that I'm most interested in is, how do we encourage people to have dual nationality, not just dual nationality, but basically operate in two countries, jobs in two countries, commitment to those two countries. I believe quite strongly this, to me, is the only way to deal with brain drain. Because you're not going to stop it. You're not going to, for Australia to say tomorrow we are not going to take a single doctor from Africa, is going to have zero impact on Africa, because they'll just go somewhere else. But for Australia to say, okay, we're going to have a facilitator program, which means that doctors can spend 1 year in Australia, 1 year at home, and we'll facilitate that. Everything's portable. Just make that a way of doing it. For Australia to say with its development assistance program, we're going to, because we're taking doctors, we should be putting money back into medical schools in African countries. So that sort of a philosophy and culture, to me, is the way in which I think we should be going. Now, I've written a bit about this development-friendly migration policy, and the sorts of things which I've focused on are these. They're not all relevant to the university situation, but I think some of them are. The first thing, though, to me, is this change in the whole culture of migration decision-making, so that it isn't just looking at the interests of the destination country, and not just looking at the interests of the origin countries. To me, is it possible to look at both and the migrant and say, right, is there ways in which everybody can win out of this situation, rather than for it only to be the destination country? And I can't guarantee that that's the case, but I think we have to ask that possible question. Remittances are obviously going to be a part of it, and facilitating remittances, to me, is an absolutely crucial part of development-friendly migration policy, because the data show that so much of remittance money is actually siphoned off by rent takers, by companies which actually charge ridiculous amounts of money to transfer money. Return migration is absolutely crucial, but not just permanent return. That tends to be focused on. But what about the whole idea of circular movement, of actually facilitating that ability to be able to move between the origin and the destination, to have jobs in both places? It's happening to an extent already. We did a survey of 300 Chinese academics in Australia. Every single one of them has a very significant relationship with at least one Chinese university. If they don't hold a position there, they frequently go back there and so on. So it's already happening. But, are there ways in which it can be facilitated? Dual nationality is now open in Australia. Interesting story on that, because One would think that Australia actually had dual nationality because we've got lots of migrants. In fact, the thing which actually got the government in 2001 to have dual nationality was the fact that it realised there was all these Australians overseas. And because it was my research which actually was used, and when it was pointed out that we had perhaps 900,000 Australian overseas who have many of them have had to give up their citizenship to be able to stay in their destination country. And that was the thing which actually got them to go for dual nationality, not the fact that we had all these migrants in Australia who should have it open to them. I think we should target development assistance to origin areas in many ways, and particularly where we're taking skilled migrants from those places. But I think that this whole idea of potential joint positions and facilitating circular migration is fairly important. I think there does need to be some sort of cultural change, and it's a cultural change which in the past I've talked about being that we have to bring our development assistance and our migration policies together in Australia, so that we look at migration policy in a wider context, because it's here to stay. It's going to be more important even more important than it has been in the past. And I believe quite strongly that Australia's really led in migration management in many ways. We get really bad press over the asylum seekers, and deservedly so. But to me, it is Australia. The more I work in other countries, the more I realise that Australia does migration fairly well. But one of the ways in which I'd like to see Australia take some leadership in this area is to embrace the whole idea of development-friendly migration, and to make that cultural change to begin with, to say, okay, can we think about migration not purely in terms of how it affects other countries, but actually taking that into account. And I think Australian universities could take some leadership in this area, because they do play a very significant role, not just through the student migration, but increasingly through staff recruitment.
Thank you very much, Professor Hugo. Well, my name's Minnie Zhao. I'm a PhD student studying skilled labour migration at University of Oxford. Thank you very much for a very insightful presentation. I wanted to ask more about the sort of recommendation for more circular migration, which I absolutely agree with. Obviously, as a lawyer, I look at sort of more the regulatory frameworks pertaining to particularly the rights of migrant workers. And I think if we are looking at a circular movement, I think it is important to not sort of restrict the rights of migrants in one country, say in Australia, and to actually give them sort of a broad-ranging rights and entitlements attached to citizenship. So I think dual nationality would ultimately be a very powerful vehicle, because otherwise you'll end up, sort of having almost like worker programs. They come and they go, and they come and go. I think it's perhaps interesting to look at circular migration in the European Union context, particularly after the accession of the new European states. My second comment pertains to the unskilled and low-skilled migrants. We focus obviously on skilled migrants in the nature of your talk on education. Now, it would be interesting for you to comment on perhaps how the migration and development discourse can tap into the low-skilled and unskilled workers. And I know we talked before, you were talking about the Pacific Islands Seasonal Workers Program, and whether that would be a model perhaps for the future in this area. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, the first one. I think what I have in mind is certainly something in terms of the circular migration is going beyond the sort of 457 model. We have a temporary business 457 visa in Australia, which is like the H1B visa in the United States, except in Australia it's not capped, which it is in the United States. And that and the universities use it massively. A lot of the people that they bring in now are on 457 visas, which means they're 4 years. Their rights are restricted in all sorts of ways. But I guess what I have in mind is permanent migration, which is circular, if I could actually put it that way, which means that people are full citizens of both countries. Now, obviously, that doesn't necessarily have to be, at least at the beginning, for everybody who comes, but actually saying, right, in some of these skilled areas for doctors and those sorts of groups, can it be that people can have full rights in both countries? So it's circular but permanent, I guess, if it would be the model which I think I'd be looking at. That doesn't mean that 457s don't have a role to play, but that sort of migration, to me, is part of a contemporary, any contemporary migration system where you must have the ability to bring people in quickly, to fill particular shortages which arise at particular times which you can't fill locally. I mean, but that's all it is. It's not a long-term thing. It's not saying, okay, we've got a long-term thing, but we'll just bring in one person for 4 years, then another person for 4 years, then another person for 4 years to fill that. That's not, to me, the right way of going about it. So I guess what I'd like to see is circular migration seen in a broader context of actually looking at the rights of the individuals, but also of the two countries involved. Low skilled, well, definitely, to me, low-skilled migration has to be part of any development-friendly migration policy because, it's for a couple of reasons. One is that we know that low-skilled migration can have really positive impacts in the origin countries, and it's one way in which in which remittances can actually get right down to communities and individuals which need them the most. Because remittances aren't that important for people who come as university staff members because they come from pretty well-off families to begin with. This is a bit off the topic, but we do work on remittances in Australia, and the biggest remittances which are sent out of Australia are not sent by the skilled migrants, they're sent by refugees. Sudanese or people from Africa who can least afford it are sending back massive amounts of money at enormous sacrifice. And not only that, they're under enormous pressure to actually send them back as well. So, but with low-skilled migration, the argument that I'd make, and you mentioned a couple of the papers that I've done on care worker migration, which I see in the future as being significant in Australia, that there's demand for low-skilled workers in Australia. How can we use that demand to create opportunities for lower skilled people, and I think particularly in the Pacific where Australia's got a major obligation. And we're starting in terms of with agricultural workers, but the program hasn't been that successful, and that's because the agricultural work is actually being done by rich students from Europe rather than poor people from the Pacific. In New Zealand, where they don't have the working holiday maker program so effective, their program to bring in Pacific workers to work in agriculture has been much more effective. Not only that, I think it's a good example, one of the few good examples around the world of a development-friendly migration policy, because it's developed not just with New Zealand's interests in mind, but the interests of the Pacific countries who are sending the migrants as well. It's really explicitly developed in that way. I would see a low-skilled migration program very much part of a development-friendly migration policy. One of the things which I've talked about with the Department of Immigration is following up the work that I did on care worker migration to see whether that we might do some pilots in that sort of area. But very, very definitely, but the management of those things and the rights of the migrants themselves and protecting those rights is a really important issue.
First of all, I'm Catherine Whittingham. I'm currently working at the University of Westminster, but I was 457 at UNSW, University of New South Wales in Sydney, business sponsored in 2000. Thank you very much for giving me my dual citizenship, by the way.
No, I won't take full credit, but they did use our research, and it was a bit backhanded because I really thought Australia, given its migration history and background, we should have had dual citizenship years ago, and not for the reason that to give to Australians who are overseas.
Well, I was actually the first non-academic member of staff to be 457'd, as it were, for UNSW, and but I've noticed over the last 10 years that has significantly changed.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, I was just reflecting on your graphs and thinking that could be almost the same for professional staff.
It's interesting that in Australia, just in the week before I left, there's a bit of a Barney going on at the moment over 457s, and it's because the Labor government has actually introduced some new regulations, or it's not new regulations so much as they're going to police much more the fact that companies have done their due diligence in attempting to get an Australian to fill the job before they go to a 457. And
I was lucky.
But because I think I believe quite strongly that these things shouldn't be there to fill ongoing positions. To me, that's something you train Australians to do, or you bring in a permanent migrant to do. But I think to me that's the biggest abuse of the program. The things you hear about are people being given low wages, or the conditions which are bad, or being exploited in some way, and that occurs. But I think that's marginal. To me, the greater abuse of the program, in inverted commas, is actually people using it as an alternative to training and education, or as an alternative to permanent migration. Which that to me is the thing which has to be effective, because I think the program itself is not a bad program. In fact, it's very effective and can have a very positive impact. But
Can I just make a comment, if I may? But I'm fascinated by this whole idea of the dual jobs, and it occurs to me we're running an event at the University of Sydney actually in July, looking at Africa and Australia university partnerships. And it occurs to me, the point of that is looking at how we can make more connections, especially in research collaborations and so on. But that might be an opportunity to start talking about this kind of issue, because they work hand in hand. If you have dual jobs, you get more international partnerships, you get more opportunities for student exchange, staff exchange, all these things that continue to build stronger relationships and better experiences.
One of the points I made in the paper I did for the Ramphal Centre was precisely that the partnerships that the Commonwealth, I think, has a role to play here, because to me the special relationship which Commonwealth countries have is a basis for the development of effective migration policy, because in working in Asia and seeing the absolute lack of any sort of trust or cooperation between origin countries and destination countries, and lack of communication about migration, that Commonwealth countries start with an enormous plus in that there are existing channels, there's existing ways in which they can collaborate and cooperate, and I believe that the partnerships, exchanging universities, exchanging staff, all that great, but how about actually having joint appointments, between the two? And that's a challenge not just for the universities, it's a real challenge for the Australian migration system to actually come up with ways in which one could do that and have the full portability and to work it through so that people could be effective. But having those joint appointments, joint citizenship.
It will help early career development, another huge issue.
And I'm not denigrating. One of the great years of my life, I was under the old Australian Asian Universities Cooperation Scheme, which was a forerunner to IDP. But in those days, it was called the Australian Asian Universities Cooperation Scheme, and it was real cooperation. I went to Hasanuddin University in Indonesia. and paid a university salary, an Indonesian salary, lived in an Indonesian university house, and killed cobras and all sorts of things. But it was an absolute 100% cooperative activity. But I was only there for a year. And, to me, if you've got someone who's not just going to be there that year, but it's going to be there in 2 years' time and 4 years' time, and that commitment so that they're staff members and they make they're not just visitors, visiting firemen who come in and do something, they're part of the structure. And to me, that sort of impact, first of all, it does, I think, to some extent compensate for the brain drain dimension, which does worry me. I mean, it worries me as an Australian that we're doing that. And it worries me that there's not the discourse in Australia about it. It's very marginalised, that discussion. But doing something about it, which actually is a lasting and has a significant impact in that origin country, and also diminishes the impact of the brain drain. I think there may be other things too that can be done that could be important. But again, I see the Commonwealth as being a sort of almost like a world leader in these sorts of things, because it starts with a relationship that's there that one can build on. And when you see just this, the total dysfunctionality of origin-destination relationships about migration at a government level, that's gold, that relationship that the Commonwealth has.
Well,
I'm Monique. I'm a work in London. But my question is really, do you have any figures on the age of migrants? What age is the demographic that people become migrants or go over?
Yeah.
And I like your idea of this, being dual citizens and having collaborations. And I think the difficulty I find is working with scholars or what have you, is that they're of the age where they have young families, and that just isn't a possibility.
Very, very interesting question, because you're absolutely right. I mean, age is critical in migration. The thing about migration, there are very few things which are absolutely true of just about all migration. But one is that they're young. That migration is enormously selective of young people, either as singles or couples in those younger age groups. And just diverting for a sec, we've done a lot of work on Australians overseas and Australian academics overseas. And what we found is that there's a window where a majority of them want to return to Australia, and that is when they have young children, that because they realise that their mobility is going to be really cut down after that once the kids get into school and so on. It's also growing up with family, and there's a whole range of things that are around that. So any program like this would have to be family friendly as well as development friendly. That there would have to be some way in which you could facilitate it, because you would really, for this sort of thing to be effective, it can't be all old people, it can't be all retirees. And to me, this is one of the real problems with a lot of the literature on return migration. They focus on return being something you do after you've finished your career. And if you look at the return migration literature, it's about that. They bring back persons and they, work their last couple of years there, or not even work at all, just retire there, back to their home country. So facilitating it so that it can be across the life cycle is a real challenge, because you're actually flying in the face of what we know about migration. And that's where there has to be a real role for policy. What can you do to actually facilitate that process? And one of the things that I would argue is that what we found out about Australians in coming back to Australia could actually be used in this case, because if you've got a young African doctor with young children, what about the possibility of them spending half their lives growing up with their grandparents and with their cousins and with their other extended family? but still having the opportunity for him to work or her to work in Australia and for their kids to have access to that as well. I mean, it's a challenge, but I think there are ways in which it really could be tackled. But that dimension is a really important one that you raise.